Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? We still awake at this point on day 2? All right. Today I'm going to share some lessons from GitHub's ongoing campaign to require millions of developers to adopt 2FA. I'm hoping you'll take away some key learnings that will leave you better prepared to help your organization solve hard problems where security and the business intersect. If you'd like to tweet or toot along or whatever it is we do these days, my social media details are up there. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. For a number of years, I led incident response, threat detection, and threat intelligence for GitHub. I spent a lot of that time investigating and responding to the compromise of user accounts on github.com. These users didn't work at GitHub, however. And while GitHub isn't accountable for the compromise of individual users who fall afoul of social engineering or account theft, we do believe that helping folks stay secure is the right thing to do. At a very high level, the consequences of a compromise of a GitHub user account can have dramatic effects on an individual or an organization. My team spent years working to identify the victims of account compromise, remediate those compromises, and then notify the affected victims on top of our day-to-day jobs to keep GitHub safe. For better or worse, I like to think that I helped keep a lot of incident responders gainfully employed during that time, but the fact that this was happening so often left me thinking a lot about how we could fix it. We have a long history of investing in user account security with efforts like user device verification and compromised password detection. So this wasn't a case of neglect or any kind of feature gap. So what do you suppose was the most common thread linking compromised accounts? I'll leave you on that all too obvious cliffhanger as I pause to introduce myself. My name is John Swanson, but you can call me Swanee. Today I'm the Director of Security Strategy for GitHub. And my running joke is that I'm the director of hot takes and hard pills due to my penchant for telling it like it is. But my job is generally to facilitate planning and facilitation for complex, long-running, and cross-functional initiatives, some of which I end up leading over the long haul. As I mentioned, I spent 4.5 years building and leading a wonderful team of incident responders, threat detection engineers, and threat intelligence professionals, and sometimes moonlighted as a crisis manager for the business in unusual scenarios like preparing for and responding to the war between Russia and Ukraine. Most importantly, I've got 2 wonderful kids and an amazing partner at home who keep me motivated and enable my success. In my spare time, I enjoy history, barbecue, and being a little bit of a cocktail nerd. So today's discussion will be centered on the human factors associated with 2FA adoption and approaches for solving these problems successfully. My hope is that you can apply the information shared here in any setting to achieve better collaborative outcomes, especially when those outcomes appear to compete with other business needs at first glance. So what's the problem that we're facing? The security of the software supply chain is a hot topic in our industry today, and for good reason. Organizations are trying to figure out how to ensure that the software that they use to operate or build their business is and remains safe. And even when organizations aren't particularly concerned with this, regulation, legislation, or compliance may be forcing them to consider it. And while there's a lot of focus on build system flaws and vulnerability exploits as a means of compromising software, the simple truth is that access to a developer account for version control, collaboration, or CI/CD is often the shortest route to theft or malicious use of a code base. So if I might, can I ask for a show of hands from the crowd here for if anyone has worked any kind of social engineering or account takeover incident? Can you raise your hands for me? Is that it? That's still a lot, but I'd be looking for more hands, I think. All right, well, in any case, that's a good number of you, and I think that illustrates my point. Your organization can build the perfect build pipeline, can manage dependencies on the tightest SLAs, and scan and review code with a fine-tooth comb and still experience an incident if a developer or engineer's account is compromised. So to answer the question I started with during my introduction, the thing that I most often observed when investigating these types of incidents was that victims didn't take advantage of the tools available to them. The vast majority of accounts compromised through social engineering didn't have 2FA enabled at all. Now, GitHub is considered to have excellent levels of voluntary 2FA adoption for a platform without access to its own hardware ecosystem like Google or Apple. Despite that reputation, our 2FA adoption rate is just under 20% of active users. I believe we must do better. So to set the stage, GitHub announced a policy requiring all users who contribute code on github.com to enable one or more forms of two-factor authentication by the end of 2023. Now, to provide a caveat or two in the name of transparency, after careful study, we've elected to exclude some categories of casual or still learning contributors, and those in settings where successfully completing a 2FA challenge can be difficult, such as educational settings. That said, we've focused our work and the resulting requirements on those accounts we believe are making the most impactful contributions to code at risk from supply chain compromise. We believe the exclusions that we've identified offer a balance of important security outcomes while keeping software development accessible to everyone. So if social engineering is so prevalent and 2FA is so effective, why does adoption remain low? Why is it so hard for us as an industry to move the needle on 2FA adoption at scale? When studying this problem, it quickly became clear that despite a ton of investment in 2FA and the associated user experiences, GitHub and the broader industry still had a long way to go to make them durable and reliable enough to begin requiring much of the platform to use them. When folks are having a poor user experience or encountering difficulty accessing a service due to 2FA, this can have a number of unintended consequences for the service. To start, it drives user support overhead through ticket volumes associated with account lockout and factor loss, potentially overwhelming our support staff and causing user uproar. Similarly, if we started requiring 2FA without investing in a better user experience, the difficulty experienced by those users might drive them to reduce their engagement with the platform, or worse yet, seek alternatives altogether. And as with many tech businesses these days, growth and rate of adoption and engagement are important metrics for us. So figuring out how to balance our objective with these important success metrics quickly became the critical problem for us to solve. In a moment, I'll get into the strategy and tactics that most of you are here for, but I want to take a second and share the secret topic of this talk. This 2FA requirement problem is a giant metaphor for the classic conundrum faced by security practitioners the world over. How can we, as professionals motivated by risk prevention or management, successfully convince the business to invest and prioritize resources allotted to other functions in the name of risk outcomes? How can you do that while limiting the drawbacks and maximizing the impact? And how can you do so while building and maintaining trust and powerful cross-functional collaboration that doesn't paint security as the often ridiculed Department of No? In our case, the challenge was to figure out how to turn the dial on 2FA without driving users away from the platform and making software development less accessible. There are a number of strategies and tactics that you can employ to solve hard security problems like these while keeping the business requirements and customer experience at the forefront. And we'll explore those through the lens of this 2FA initiative. So I'm going to take a second and put my history nerd hat on here and share a little bit about how I approach complex problem spaces like the one we're here to talk about today. Karl von Clausewitz, pictured here, wasn't really the first to define strategy and tactics, but he provided much of the modern interpretation of these terms, and his teachings remain central to military sciences to this day. But we're not here to talk about military theory, so why does this matter? I like to think about problems, hard problems particularly, and the solutions to those problems in the context of these two separate but symbiotic domains. Realistically speaking, both perspectives are critical. In practice, one or the other is often shortchanged. As technical professionals, we often tend to go straight down the tactical rabbit hole in search of solutions. This is natural. Many of us have deep specialization in solving technical problems via technical means. And for many, this is their passion. However, when we don't pause to consider how those tactical decisions relate to more strategic business requirements, constraints, or risks, we might build something that either underdelivers or even introduces new problems and costs. On the flip side, more strategy-oriented leaders may not pause to consider important technical implications of a chosen solution or objective. Ignoring the tactical picture is equally dangerous, risking poor estimates about complexity, timeline, or cost. So my recommendation is to intentionally spend time thinking about, exploring, and assessing your plans from both of these perspectives. While the strategic payoff may not be immediate, it will put you, your peers, your customers, and your business in a better and more sustainable position that maximizes the value of your investments over time. So let's move into strategy. When I think about strategy as it relates to key initiatives, the most important aspect to account for is how the problem you're trying to solve and its potential solutions will affect the business and its aims. Ultimately, each initiative should carry a benefit to the org, one that ideally aligns closely with one or more higher-level company objectives, success metrics, or priorities. And if you've taken the time to consider the strategic implications of your work and you can't identify a clear, unambiguous benefit to the organization, that's a strong signal that it might be time to pause and reassess whether or not to continue investing in the work. That said, remember that concluding an initiative isn't strategically viable or beneficial after careful analysis isn't a failure. Sometimes it's simply a matter of putting something on hold for a time when the organization's needs, goals, or resources are better suited to the work. For GitHub, the strategic benefit of our 2FA effort was clear. Trust by design is a core company principle and priority, and bringing 2FA to millions of developers is a great way to earn and retain community trust. More importantly, the effort will make software of all kinds more secure, benefiting the entire ecosystem. The scientific method that we're all taught as students is a great starting point. Just as you might research a scientific hypothesis, research and discovery are essential for large and complex initiatives like this one. Research helps understand the problem, the potential solutions, and the implications better, and avoid narrow or suboptimal outcomes that only serve a limited audience or introduce unexpected new problems or costs. Our research was broad, and it included typical and internal and external sources like best practice or prior work, but we also paid close attention to the higher level company and department goals and metrics in service of the better strategic outcomes we just discussed. Additionally, we involved diverse stakeholders from the earliest stages of our research. My time in incident response taught me that folks well beyond security, engineering, and product offer a ton of valuable perspective and expertise. Our 2FA effort involved support, public relations, legal, and others from the very beginning, and we benefited immensely from that input and buy-in. As an excellent example of the collaborative research opportunities here, we had a leg up due to ongoing work by our NPM team. They were tightening their requirements for high-impact package maintainers at the time our broader effort kicked off. And though the population of affected users was smaller at NPM than it will be for GitHub, NPM's journey was a useful analog, and we benefited from the presence of their product manager on our project team from day one. Their experience and insights were invaluable as we entered our own planning process. Now, before planning or any decision making, I recommend that you pause to define how you want to work. I generally try to document collaboration and communication expectations, any hard business requirements, and problem-solving values. These become your operating principles. They're tactical guidelines through and through, but a key strategic planning step often missed by planners and leaders. I use these principles to align the team and validate decisions throughout the course of the initiative over time. Avoid inconsistency or gradual departure from the overall aims by checking that important decisions you make down the road follow those principles. It's a red flag for me if the proposed outcome of a decision doesn't match those original operating principles. As an example, I'm going to share some of the actual operating principles developed for GitHub's 2FA effort. The first of these was that internal metrics on user activity, though we should consider them, must not be viewed as outright obstacles to improving user account security. Conversely, security improvements must not come at the expense of user experience or accessibility. And finally, good account security is a right and not a privilege, and none of this must rely on additional licensing. Now, while you don't need to write it down in stone, once you've conducted your research, you've chosen your objectives, you do need to start by writing these things down in a durable format. Here, I also try to capture any forecasted needs in terms of human resourcing, cost, or operational overhead, and discuss and illuminate possible risks. The resulting document forms the foundation of a fuller road mapping and planning process to follow, and it gives everyone a clear reference point for where the work is headed and why. This kind of planning document also becomes a vital tool for socializing the effort, making it easier to advocate for and align others with the work in question. And I find it useful when working with senior leadership as well, as it helps them better reason about how to fund or prioritize the work that I propose. So if you'd like a shortcut to creating your own strategic planning document, you can snag a copy of the template that I commonly use here. I know QR codes might be a little iffy this week, but I promise it goes where it says it goes. I'll give folks a second in case they want to snag this code now, but the template will also be available on the briefing page for the talk. So before we move on to tactics, I want to emphasize how critical good research, clear operating principles, and a carefully chosen set of objectives are. I've been asked before if this kind of diligent strategic preparation is necessary and why we can't just start shipping improvements and figure it out as we go. In an industry which rewards fast time to market and growth, this is understandable. But when you take the time to complete these steps comprehensively, document them durably, and socialize them broadly, you're building a solid strategic foundation for the execution of the tactical work that follows. Done properly, this work ensures that the initiative is well aligned with business needs, realities, and aims. This strategic preparation becomes the North Star that you can use to frame future decisions and trade-offs around, and prevents long projects from straying from the original objective. Now, these steps may not be necessary for smaller projects, but for complex long-term work, this kind of time and attention invested at the strategic layer produces a more resilient and successful initiative. So let's move into tactics. Once you have a sense of what you're doing, why, and how it will impact the business, you need to shift gears and get down to brass tacks. To start, we had to build and maintain a high-trust environment where folks feel safe and valued so they can bring their best work and ideas forward without any hesitation. The pilots pictured here have to develop an enormous sense of shared trust and accountability to fly at 500 miles an hour with their wingtips just feet apart. This is especially important with many forms of cross-functional work, especially complex work like our 2FA effort. If each of these pilots was only looking out for themselves, the results would be disastrous. So if you're the leader in this scenario, this is your job number one. My personal approach to this is to set and enforce clear expectations around communication, collaboration, and decision-making. I try to be an active, positive example by making space for everyone to contribute, and use the gavel that I hold to provide a platform for voices that aren't getting airtime. I also express regular, visible gratitude and encouragement for contributions of all shapes and sizes. If you're not the leader, however, you still have a role to play. Speak up for your peers, raise concerns on behalf of other teams, solicit feedback and perspectives from other stakeholders early and often, and show your own visible appreciation for your teammates and their efforts. Now, before moving on, I want to emphasize why this is so important. In my time leading our 2FA project, as well as others, I've seen this kind of healthy environment encourage formerly hesitant or less engaged employees come out of their shells and deliver absolutely amazing results that made a huge difference in our success. Don't waste that opportunity. Now, while it can be tempting to keep teams lean when working on complex projects like these, I'd offer that this instinct is a little bit of a fallacy. There are substantial benefits to casting a wider net and involving a broad variety of subject matter experts, especially outside the technical disciplines. The contributions offered during our 2FA effort by folks outside security, engineering, and product have been central to our ability to make good decisions. We invited those key stakeholders to the table early, ensuring that they were able to plan ahead and contribute to addressing important dependencies or any identified risks. And this made a big difference when enrollment began in earnest, as teams like support were invested in our effort, and they were well aware of the expected impact. This broad inclusion also helps you build durable working relationships that will benefit you when you work on other initiatives cross-functionally. Finally, to prevent broad collaboration from devolving into slower committee-driven consensus seeking, I try to be intentional about the roles that collaborators are asked to play. I work to quietly establish clear roles and expectations without making folks feel disenfranchised or excluded in any way. Not everyone can be a decision maker or have their hands on the keyboard at all times. If there are concerns about a decision, I ensure that contributors are heard, consider their input fairly, and I make it clear that I take full accountability and I'm always open to adjusting as we go down the road. Collaboration is a powerful force multiplier, but apply that force multiplier deliberately to prevent it from slowing you down. I mentioned some of these teams at other points during the presentation, but for a 2FA effort of this nature, this is a great starting point in terms of who you should consider including. Some organizations may be structured a little differently. You may have other teams that make more sense, so adjust as needed. Now, I admit that the title of this slide is a very personal perspective and maybe a bit of a hot take, but I put it this way because I want to talk about the importance of pragmatic decision-making as a tactical tool. When dealing with long-term work of this complexity, it's important not to gamble too aggressively and pay for it in the long run. Instead, I try to set reasonable goals and then raise the bar only when it becomes clear we'll meet that first set of objectives. In our profession today, there's a lot of emphasis on moving quickly and setting ambitious goals. But I think it's important to draw the distinction between tempo and pace. I believe you can absolutely still keep up a steady tempo and make progress without rushing or setting unrealistic goals and expectations that at the end of the day only serve to reduce confidence in your work and risk losing critical trust when they can't be met. As an example, early in our planning process, we considered more expansive overall requirements and investigated removing SMS 2FA support altogether in the wake of emerging consensus around its disadvantages. After a lot of consideration and some friendly debate, we ultimately decided not to do either, based on a number of interesting challenges around the overall accessibility of 2FA in certain use cases. GitHub is a global platform. We've got users and aspiring developers spread across the world and at various stages of their journey. Our research identified several cases that we needed to accommodate to ensure that we remained available to everyone we want to include, such as users in educational settings like the computer lab that's pictured here. Those folks may not have access to phone-based second factors, and we were also concerned about developers in developing parts of the world where access to non-SMS forms of 2FA can be challenging. And while decisions like these might not be perfect from a risk management perspective, they help us pragmatically raise the bar without denying usability or accessibility to important parts of our community. So continuing the theme of prudent decision-making, consider how hard data can better help you plan, decide, and measure your success over time. Look closely at what your platform or product's data can tell you about how users interact with your 2FA features, and use that data during your planning process. Good data is also critical to measuring the effectiveness of your initiatives going forward. Key performance indicators should be identified before work begins, and dashboards and alerting should be set up to support monitoring as that work progresses. Here especially, remember to consider the broader business and look for data beyond the product or service itself. An important KPI for us is the volume of 2FA-related support tickets. As you can see here, we started off with too many tickets coming in, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we fixed that in a second. Remember, the data is only as good as the decisions that you make based on it. Leaders must not hesitate to react decisively if data begins to surface problems. We set an expectation early with our project team that if data showed that our enrollment campaign was causing business or the users to struggle, we'd slow down or pause until we believed we had corrected the issue. Using this data, it became clear that despite GitHub's leading position on 2FA and account security features, we still had a lot of work to do if we didn't want our users ending up looking like Grumpy Cat here. Exploration of the support ticket volumes I discussed on the last slide told us that too many users were getting locked out of accounts and generating too many tickets seeking to recover those accounts. And looking hard at real usage data indicated that folks weren't taking important steps like downloading their recovery codes, and that they weren't using 2FA regularly enough to reinforce the habit. This information led to an early decision not to begin any enrollment at all until we could fund and execute significant improvements to the user experience around 2FA and account lockout recovery. While we could have started enrollment in 2022, we believed, based on the data that we saw, that doing so would be counterproductive and risky. As a result, we spent 2022 and early 2023 implementing user experience improvements, which I'll share on the following slides. One of our first decisions was to increase the accessibility and convenience of 2FA by offering additional types that were easier to use. Our hope here was that folks who found 2FA more convenient would be more likely to adopt it voluntarily. This began with the introduction of push notification-based 2FA in GitHub Mobile, pictured here, in January of 2022. We also introduced a fresh 2FA configuration flow in November of 2022 that made it easier for users to navigate the enrollment process and less likely to misconfigure something, hopefully making onboarding easier and faster for folks, in addition to encouraging best practices. This flow was designed to be opinionated, relegating SMS 2FA to a less visible alternative option. This change reduced SMS-based factor enrollment rates by about 23% in favor of more secure options. Finally, the flow also included additional emphasis on downloading recovery codes before a user can complete that process. Now, as I mentioned previously, our research also revealed that folks don't use their second factors often enough after setting them up, and therefore tend to lose them. In January of this year, this information led us to introduce a 2FA verification flow that users must complete 28 days after they enroll in 2FA. If users fail this verification, they'll be prompted to reconfigure as long as they're coming from a verified device and have a properly authenticated existing session. This helps prevent lockout from factor loss or misconfiguration, and we find that about 1 in 4 users have a chance to safely reconfigure 2FA instead of landing in a lockout. And finally, we know that personal workflows differ greatly and that the ability to customize 2FA is important. To make 2FA even easier to use day to day, we introduced the ability to prefer 2FA methods based on what works best for you or your threat model in February of this year. While this specific change is unlikely to move the needle in a dramatic way on its own, we believe that important improvements like these make 2FA much more pleasant to use overall. Now, as I mentioned before, pace isn't everything. And specifically here, I'm talking about the rollout of the enrollment campaign itself. Though it's tempting to start with large groups of users at the outset, we elected to plan a gradually scaling rollout campaign that allows us to learn, monitor the data, mature our processes, and build confidence in the results of our work. We separated users into groups based on actions that they take on our platform, which represent increasing levels of risk. As a result, our earliest enrollment groups are the smallest groups and generally contain technically adept users akin to a group of early adopters or beta testers. This allowed us to validate our methods and the impact of our user experience improvements using the data discussed a moment ago, and potentially pull the plug or iterate if we needed to. As pictured here, we also designed a relatively gentle enrollment campaign with a 7-day opt-out built in. This enabled us to focus on making customers aware of the requirement and helped us prevent big spikes in enrollment all at once that might have overwhelmed us, risking reputational damage or the project altogether. Now, anytime you're dealing with technical changes to a product or a platform, it's easy to get lost in the technical preparations and forget to look around. Preparing your internal staff is just as important as any technical improvements that we're making as part of our 2FA program. Customer-facing support, customer success, sales, and sales engineering staff need to be aware of what's happening, when, and how they can better support customers who have questions or concerns. During our effort, we developed and socialized briefings and frequently asked questions, and we shared those internally at various stages of the work. We also used regular internal communication patterns like newsletters and intranet posts, but you can also use mass emails if that's how your organization works best. I also recommend engaging leadership in key areas to signal boost these communications and ensure that their teams are aware of the work and ready to go. But this also goes beyond awareness. Support especially is an area that needs careful consideration when you're preparing to enroll large numbers of folks in 2FA. We needed to make improvements to both internal and external policy and process in order to make supporting 2FA users more sustainable. Support was too often stuck attempting to handle appeals from locked-out users who didn't have adequate recovery factors for a safe recovery, and it was burying them in tickets. To fix this, we implemented a number of process changes internally to allow support to more quickly and empathetically handle 2FA tickets with no safe path to resolution. Then we backed those up by publishing a public account recovery policy to give support the ground to stand on. Without these changes, there's simply no way we'd been able to sustain the influx of tickets expected when you're adding millions of 2FA users. Finally, our effort is about changing the narrative as much as it is any set of technical changes. Our goal is to change mindsets and normalize the use of 2FA. So how do we do that? Well, we believe that the answer really is lots of thematically consistent comms with a clear sense of why it's important and an easily followed call to action. And we start these as early as possible. When communicating with users, it's important that you ensure that your message is clear and minimize changes in language across each message, especially around any required steps or deadlines. Additionally, we also intentionally took advantage of multiple media when communicating changes and requirements to users. We sent emails, we used site banners, we published multiple blogs, and we boosted all of those efforts with social media where it made sense. And we did all this frequently and consistently. As pictured here, some users don't take action until as late as the 5th or 6th email notification. So we elected to over-communicate in this case. So where'd we end up? Well, we started enrollment in March, and those first groups have since completed their enrollment. And in short, what we saw was very positive. Press coverage and social media responses were awesome, and many of you seem to be cheering us on. Most importantly, we received very little negative feedback from users, and that which we did receive helped us further iterate on our communication strategy. In terms of measuring our success, perhaps the most powerful indicator of our focus on user experience is the volume of user-submitted support tickets. Since launching our 2FA enrollment program and all of the user experience improvements that support it, we've seen a 42% reduction in 2FA-related support tickets. It's likely that this volume will actually continue to climb as we add millions more users, but we're excited about what the early data is telling us. Further, we've seen a 33% decrease in the number of account lockout recovery attempts since introducing our improved 2FA configuration flow. This indicates that fewer folks are getting locked out, and we believe, much like the previous slide, that this will probably rise in time, but this is a positive sign that our user experience improvements will help flatten that curve into something that's sustainable for us. Finally, we've seen a 38% increase in users downloading or printing their recovery codes over the same time frame. And while I'm sure some of these will end up eaten by the dog or lost under the bed, this is a great step forward and maybe a contributing factor to why we're seeing lower levels of account lockout currently. Now, one of the less obvious or direct ways to assess the impact of our work has been observing how the broader software development ecosystem has reacted. To our delight, it seems that our intention to change the nature of the conversation and normalize 2FA usage is taking root. RubyGems and PyPI have announced their own 2FA requirements since our initial announcement, and we're excited to have their help in raising the bar for everyone. Thanks to the folks at these organizations and others who are joining us on this journey. Now, before we get too excited, there's still a long way to go in 2023. Millions of enrollments still lie ahead of us. Enrollment will continue in groups through the remainder of the year until we hit our initial targets. And in fact, the next batches start next week. We're also hard at work on passkey support, and we launched the public beta just last month. While passkeys might not be a perfect fit for every threat model, we're hopeful that they'll make adopting 2FA even easier and more reliable than before, and we're really excited about the initial engagement figures from the beta. Looking into 2024 and beyond, GitHub will continue to look for ways to raise the bar surrounding secure user authentication. Tentative areas of exploration include more varied and durable means of account lockout recovery, as well as possibly eventually expanding our 2FA requirements as 2FA becomes increasingly ubiquitous and accessible. So as we begin wrapping up, I want to summarize some of the key lessons to be learned from GitHub's efforts. For 2FA, keep trust by design at the forefront. Expanding 2FA requirements isn't a decision to be made without great care. Your user experience is likely to be the limiting factor in any effort to widely grow 2FA use. So invest heavily in getting it right and pair that work with careful internal preparation. I'd also encourage folks to look hard at the demographics of their products or platforms and understand what impact 2FA requirements can have. Make sure an overambitious objective doesn't result in specific demographics being unable to access your service. Remember, while we're all here to make the world a safer place, Security that isn't usable isn't security at all. Also emphasize the importance of both internal and external comms, and engage the comms and marketing professionals in your organization to help you craft a great communications plan. And finally, implement a wisely paced enrollment strategy that allows your organization to successfully monitor the impact of the effort without drowning users or the business. Now, regardless of the subject matter, a lot of the strategy and tactics that we applied to this 2FA effort will help you navigate the human factors associated with challenging cross-functional work as a security professional. Take the time to prepare your team and the broader organization for what lies ahead. Deeply understand the problem, explore your organization's needs and goals with a broad, collaborative team, and only then assess and select potential solutions by defining an objective. Once that's done, write it down somewhere durable, socialize it broadly, and that will help you ensure that everyone is on the same page before meaningful work ever begins. Cultivate a safe, transparent, and positive environment where everyone feels welcome and valued for their contributions, no matter what role they play. Finally, involve folks across your organization, especially those in roles outside security, engineering, and product. These are simple principles, but they've helped us navigate a challenging problem with wide impacts at GitHub. They've also helped form the foundation of my own personal approach for developing strategy and leading teams to solve all sorts of hard problems across multiple disciplines. I hope you'll take these lessons away and actively invest more time in this kind of deliberate approach to solving hard problems, regardless of whether or not you're requiring 2FA or coaching a baseball team. Now, before wrapping up, I want to take a minute and practice what I preach by sharing how privileged and grateful I am to work on this important 2FA effort with a wide cast of amazing professionals across a bunch of disciplines at GitHub and beyond. The folks pictured here are some, but not all, of the folks who have contributed to this work over the last couple of years. Each contributor brought something unique and important to the work that helped us find a successful path forward to raising the bar for software security. I wouldn't be standing here talking to all of you without the efforts of these folks and many more across the industry. And that's a wrap. Thanks so much for coming to my talk. If folks have questions, we've got about 2 minutes. I'm happy to take a couple here, and then I'm going to move to the wrap room, and you can join me there if you have additional questions.